Hey there, welcome back to our SharePoint Server 2013 Core Solutions training course. The name of this nugget is Installing SharePoint Server 2013 Practice. The agenda for this demonstration nugget is as follows. We're going to set up a brand new server farm. Of course, we can't get off the ground with SharePoint Server 2013 farms until we install our first server. It reminds me of the old expression, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So to that point, we'll install our initial server. We'll then extend our farm by introducing a second SharePoint server. Now, the specific role of that second server, whether it's a web front end or an app server, doesn't really matter. The procedure is largely the same. We'll then do initial farm configuration and post-installation steps, particularly how to optimize the client browser for best interaction with SharePoint. Now, I've mentioned in the past that SharePoint functions really well, thank you very much, with any contemporary web browser. For the purpose of our 7331 exam study, of course, the only web browser on the face of the earth is Internet Explorer 10. You know the drill, friends. Let's get started. Here we are on a Windows Server 2012 data center box named MEM2. As you can see from my BG info output in the lower left, this is a member server in the NuggetSphere.local domain. I don't have any server roles of note installed on this box. It's pretty garden variety, pretty plain vanilla. I've verified that this server meets the system requirements to support SharePoint Server 2013, so we're really ready to go. I guess the only other preliminary thing I'll tell you is that I have another machine in my domain called DCSQL2 that's functioning, you guessed it, as an Active Directory Domain Services domain controller, as well as a SQL Server 2012 SP1 database server. I guess before doing anything else now, I need to mount the SharePoint Server 2013 media, so let's take care of that. In so doing, we see this pop up. We'll tap to choose what happens, and I will select Run Splash.hta. HTA is an HTML-based splash screen that Microsoft has used for a while as a launcher for their enterprise server products. Now we're going to go past the preparation items. These are useful links. We're concentrating in the install area. Notice that we have a separate link for installing software prerequisites or installing the server. Now, in the next nugget, I'm going to demonstrate so-called advanced installation techniques. So I'll take you into the command line in PowerShell at that point. In this lesson, we're going to focus predominantly on the graphical environment. So let's hit the prerequisite installer link. That immediately kicks open the SharePoint 2013 Products Preparation Tool. And let's review what's going to happen here. The preparation tool is going to install .NET Framework 4.5, WMF 3.0. As I promised you, we're going to add a server role, a couple of them, the application server and the web server IIS roles. We need the SQL Server 2008 R2SP1 client, Microsoft Sync runtime, App Fabric, identity extensions. I will put up a link where you can read about each one of these. If you're that much of a geek, full disclosure, I am, you can read about the specific purposes of each of these prerequisites. There's actually a nice link here, as a matter of fact, to take you to that spot. Let's click Next. We have to accept the terms of the license agreement to continue, and obviously this server does need a connection to the internet. It's now taking care of the roles, as you see here, and then it's going to proceed with downloading the assets it needs. Now, while that's cooking, I'm going to fire up Server Manager. And once this application finishes loading, we'll go to Local Server. And if you haven't already done this, I actually set this up through my domain controller group policy to automate it. But this Internet Explorer Enhanced Security configuration, I would suggest you turn that off. Now, of course, the idea is we don't browse the web or use web applications on our server, but you and I both know with more and more management tools being web-based or being browser-based at the least, I personally find this to be more of a pain than a security benefit. We can selectively enable or disable this for administrators or regular users. Not that you'd expect a domain user to log on interactively to your server, but at any rate, I've turned those off. And we've got the prep tool still cooking. I'm going to pause the video while this completes. As I told you, the system does pick up a restart or need a restart after we do the prerequisite installer. Now you'll notice that if your machine has components already installed, those don't get installed. By contrast, if there's a restart required before you can install additional components, you'll see those here as we do. So let's finish and reboot. And we're back from the reboot. The good news is that the products preparation tool immediately picks up where it left off, so we don't have to manually restart the installation. Notice, as I just said a moment ago, that if something is already installed, we see no action taken, and everything else is installed successfully. That's awesome. Of course, we have to restart a second time, but small price to pay, right? All right, we're back from our second reboot, but unfortunately, we don't start setup automatically, and that's as it should be. The prerequisite installer step is separate from the main setup.exe procedure. Let's open File Explorer, go into Computer. I'll right-click my DVD icon and select Install or Run Program from your media. This will open up the HTA splash screen again. This time we will select Install SharePoint Server. We're prompted for the product key right off the bat. After entering said key, we'll continue. Of course, we have to again accept the terms of the license agreement. We come to the all-important server type dialog. It's pretty easy here. You pretty much want to ignore the standalone option unless you're doing a trial, development, or demonstration. Standalone installs everything with SQL Server Express. We want to leave the default option, which is used for production environments, includes all components. We can expand the farm, but we have to have a full installation of SQL Server available on the network. If we go to File Location, we'll see that the default locations for our binaries are C program files, Microsoft Office servers, and then under there you have 15.0, that's the specific product version, and then data. Let's click Install, and we'll proceed to hurry up and wait, as they say. Once we finish the binary load portion of SharePoint Server 2013 installation, you'll see we're prompted to run the SharePoint Products Configuration Wizard. I'm going to leave that checked because that is exactly what we do need to do. I'll exit out of the splash screen because we don't need that anymore. The first page of the SharePoint Products Configuration Wizard tells us that we're going to need the name of our database server. That's reasonable enough. That's going to be DC SQL 2. We're also going to need credentials for a database access account. Now, on my domain controller, I've created a few service accounts. I've created one called SQL Service that's being used for SQL Server, and another domain user named SP Service that will be, you guessed it, for SharePoint. Let's click Next to proceed. We see a message box letting us know we're going to have some service interruption here. We're going to need to reboot IIS. That's fine. We have to click Yes to continue. And this is going to be a new server farm installation. Note that the other option is what you'd choose when you're installing subsequent servers. Let's click Next. This is where we specify our database information. As we said, DC SQL 2 is the name of mine. Database, this is the farm configuration database. Just one of these across the entire farm. And what I always do is add farm to this to make it easier when I'm in SQL Server Management Studio to figure out which database is in fact the farm DB. Let's specify Nugget Sphere / this is the NetBIOS domain name, SP service, and the password for that credential. Let's click Next. We're pausing as we're making a network connection to DC SQL 2 to my default SQL Server instance. Next, we're asked to supply a passphrase. This protects the farm against rogue installations. Let's supply a strong password here and confirm it, and then click Next. Now we're going to create the central administration web application. We're going to use an off port here, certainly not port 80. I'm going to select 1988. That number needs to be between 1 and 65535. Remember that the first 1023 or so ports are well known and reserved, so choose a high number. Also keep in mind ports that are being used for other services in your network. We're going to begin with NTLM authentication, which is reasonably secure. We're going to do an entirely separate couple of nuggets on auth, so I'll leave that discussion for then. We'll click Next. Let's verify our settings here. You'll want to make special note of the central administration URL, which is mem2:1988. Let's click Next, and we'll go through those steps. While that happens, I'm going to press the Windows key on my keyboard to show you that our start screen is populated with some extra tiles. If you needed to bail out of the configuration wizard for any reason, maybe you were having connectivity issues with SQL Server and so forth, you can always rerun it by using this tile here. What I've found, and you've probably found too, that these live tiles are pretty annoyingly truncated with their titles. For instance, this one says SharePoint 2013 Products. How do we know what that is? We can hover over it to see a tooltip. Unfortunately, that's about all we can do. You see a link here for the SharePoint 2013 Central Administration app. We also have a link for the SharePoint 2013 Management Shell, which in effect is just basically a regular old PowerShell v3 session that has the SharePoint module preloaded for you. That's really it. So let's come back to our desktop tile. We're echoing what's happening here, creating the configuration database. It's going to take a while for this to complete, so again, I'm going to pause the video. Okay, configuration successful. Good deal. Hey, I want to pause here for just a second. Again, the biggest way I've seen this fail, the most common failure I've seen, again, deals with connectivity problems between your new SharePoint server and your SQL server. So make sure that your Content Access account has appropriate permissions in SQL Server. The other thing, of course, is firewall. SQL Server listens at TCP 1433 by default, so make sure that that port is unblocked, that communication is possible between your SharePoint server and your SQL Server. Now, we're going to cover security best practices later, and one of the security best practices is to move SQL Server to a non-default port. So, of course, there you'll need to just apply the same firewall rules, the firewall allowances, to the new port ID. Now this little blurb tells us that when we close this wizard, we're going to connect to the central admin website to continue our farm configuration, and that may take a little while to do, so it's going to kick open our Internet Explorer default web browser, which I'll maximize. The first time we log into central administration, we have our initial farm configuration to do. And step 0 is to opt either into the CEIP or opt out of it. The Customer Experience Improvement Program involves sending anonymous error reports to Microsoft. So you can make that decision in the light of your preferences and click OK to continue. Now, this is the big question. Do you want to use the wizard or not? I'm going to show you the manual installation later. I want to show you both, so we'll start the easy way first, start the wizard, just so you can see what it looks like. I know in your production environment you're going to go manual, right, because that's what I suggested for you. Let's look at the steps. First, services. Now this involves the service account. This is the farm services account. It tells us here that services, and by services we mean service applications. It says for security reasons it's recommended that you use an account that's different from the farm admin account. Note that we can use an existing managed account. Now SP Service was the account we specified during our config wizard run. Note that SharePoint has co-opted that account and made it a managed account for us. Isn't that interesting? Alternatively, we can specify an existing credential in Active Directory here as a new managed account. I'm going to go the path of least resistance and keep SP Service here. Now I mentioned that the wizard's downfall is that it doesn't give you much flexibility. Don't let me dissuade you from the fact that you can deselect services that you don't want. We see an alphabetized list of our service applications here. The downside, as I said, is that if we proceed here with any of these selected, and as this blurb tells us, the services will run with default settings on all servers in your farm. So we have no choice over database names or initial configuration options, you see? So we have access services where we can publish access databases to SharePoint. We have our app management for the app catalog, business data connectivity, Excel services, language translation, managed metadata, performance point, PowerPoint conversion. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see a little bit of information regarding each one in the list. Usage and health data collection. Any of these that you know you don't need, simply deselect them. Just as an example, I'll deselect the Performance Point Service application just for grins. We'll come down to the bottom and click Next to continue. This working on it is something that Microsoft added to let us know that SharePoint is quote-unquote thinking. I find it a little bit annoying, a little bit cheesy, but Microsoft never asked me my opinion. As you know, the other main task of the SharePoint Initial Farm Wizard is to create your first site collection. This is going to be deployed in the SharePoint 80 web application that's also been created by now. I'm going to call this Nugget Sphere Training Site, and we're going to deploy this as a top-level site, so I'll select the / managed path. Note that we can go into managed paths here with the Define Managed Paths link. Experience version, we have a choice between 2010 and 2013. I'm going to, of course, stay with 2013. And by far the most common site collection template is Team Site. But notice that we can do blog, developer site, project site, or community site. If we have the enterprise license available to us, we can do a document center, e-discovery center, record center, BI center, etc. Publishing or custom. I'm going to leave Team Site. Note we can skip this if we want to, but I'm not going to skip it. We'll click OK. While this is cooking, let's cover web browser configuration. In IE Explorer 10, we'll open the gear and come down to Internet Options. We'll want to add our SharePoint portals to the Trusted Sites zone. So we'll select Trusted Sites, click Sites, and just make sure that your server is in the list. You may or may not want to require HTTPS. I'm not using HTTPS though, so that's fine. Another thing you'll want to do is bypass your proxy for local addresses. If you're using a transparent proxy to filter web traffic, we can, through group policy or in the Internet Options dialog, as we see here, come over to Connections, LAN Settings. If you are using a proxy server, make sure to bypass that proxy for LAN addresses so users can have a direct pipeline to your SharePoint server. Alright, so now we have our details here, our site title and our address. I'm going to right-click this and open it in a new tab to make sure that the SharePoint 80 web application and site collection work okay. And we'll click Finish to complete the configuration wizard here in Central Administration. Here's the finished Central Administration web application. We'll want to add this to our favorites, so we'll hit star, add to favorites, make sure that's there. By way of post-installation steps, this comes directly from the Microsoft TechNet library. You'll want to spend time in Central Administration setting up your usage and health data collection options, diagnostic logging. All of this is for troubleshooting purposes and auditing purposes. You need to set up SMTP email, both outgoing and incoming, and of course configuring search settings. More on that stuff later. Let's go to our other tab, and this is what the Team Site template looks like in the SharePoint 2013 experience. A lot of negative space, a lot of white space. It's much different from previous versions for sure. Now let's jump right into adding a second server to the farm. We'll install DC SQL 2 as a second SharePoint server actually. Let me mount the media. And we're going to need to go through all the same steps that we just completed on MEM2. I'm going to do an abridged version here to save time. So we'll go through the prerequisite installer as such and go through the reboots and all that. You know the drill with that. Having installed the prerequisites, now we'll jump into the middle part of the installation, which you'll remember from before. We'll accept the terms of the license agreement, continue, and we're prompted to install now with no other additional choices. SharePoint detected that SQL Server is running on this box, so a standalone installation is not possible. Also, it's a domain controller. I think the domain controller piece is the critical one, actually. After laying down the binaries, of course, we'll run the product's configuration wizard next. Buzz through this to get to the important screen for our purposes. Here it is. Connect to an existing server farm. The database server is DC SQL 2. We'll retrieve the database name using SQL Server Browser Service. That resolution was fast, of course, because we're on the server. And yes, the database farm configuration database is this. So let's click Next. Unless we know the farm passphrase, we're not going to be able to add a new server to the farm. Fortunately, I know it. So we'll add it and click Next. If we hit Advanced Settings, The choice is, do we want to bring up another instance of central administration? The suggestion is not to do that. We just need the one installation of CA. So I'll leave that option. We'll come back and click Next to run through the wizard proper. We're almost finished here, friends. Okay then, so we're finished. Let's click Finish out of this wizard and connect to central administration on this second SharePoint server. On this particular server, I'm going to cancel out of the wizard. Now note that if you decide to configure your server manually and you then want to revisit the wizard, we can do that. So let's click Cancel. And right here, Configuration Wizards on the main page, we can start the farm configuration wizard with no problem. So that's it, friends. Let's go now under System Settings, Manage Servers in this farm, and we now have both of our boxes. We have DC SQL 2 that has just the bare minimum services running, and we have Mem2 that's hosting everything because we went through the wizard there. So to review what we covered in this demo, we did SharePoint Server 2013 installation from soup to nuts. We installed an initial server, set up a new server farm. You understand how all the phases of installation work now. We then integrated and extended by adding a second server to the farm, and we understand how initial farm configuration works. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.